The Dark Elves, strong and deadly infantry, armor-piercing damage focus, supported by beasts and monsters. In this video, I will show every unit from the Dark Elf roster and include their stats before and after research, XP, and Redline skills. I'll also go over the lords and their specific abilities and skills they gain. So as you can see on this example here, I got all the stats for all the units with the Redline skills, research, and XP. So basically, this will imply that you can get a better, clear vision of how the units will improve during the campaign to make better decisions overall. So your army majority consists of great infantry, great missiles, good cavalry, but they are expensive, great single entities, good flyers, armor-piercing emphases, but they lack health and they lack some range. Those are their weaknesses. So in terms of army specifics, there is the murderous prowess. So basically, you will kill a specific number of combatants, and after that happens, it will trigger this ability here, the murderous prowess. It will increase the unit melee attack, charge bonus, armor piercing missile damage, leadership, and vigor per second for 90 seconds. So basically, when this procs after some kills have been conducted, then you'll get a lot of buffs to your whole army. Then there's a second variation called Murderous Mastery. In essence, it's the same as the previous one, but it causes fear and it actually lasts longer. So for instance, when that murderous prowess hits, the executioners will have all those bonuses on for 2 minutes, 120 seconds. So, starting off with Malekith, a powerful hybrid melee and spellcaster lord with great armor and a silver shield, lots of leadership, good melee attack, good melee defense, a decent amount of weapon strength, although not a lot of armor piercing. Yeah, he's a menace and he's best known for both his good combat stats and the lore of dark magic. So for his abilities in campaign, he does have the Hold the Line, which is a very basic known buff to allies in range, melee defense, more leadership. It's always nice. He also has the Gaze of Malice. This is an active breath ability, basically has 3 charges and causes moderate magical damage, actually. Now, we do have the Circlet of Iron, this passive ability. It gives him power recharge and reduced miscast chance. It also affects all allies in range, and basically it's a good idea to have Malekith also with at least another caster in the army as well to benefit from this as well. Now, he has Destroyer, which increases the cooldowns of any enemies and gives them reduced spell resistance, so it's great. He can benefit a lot more from his spells or benefit other spells usage, so that is a great passive ability there. And finally, he does have Supreme Spell Shield, giving him spell resistance and reducing enemy power recharge and reserves per second if they are spellcasters. Morathi, she's a great spellcaster lord with some melee capabilities, actually. She's just lacking armor and a shield, but with good melee attack and relatively average melee defense. She does have armor piercing damage and a bonuses versus large. She has a mixed lore of dark, shadows, and death, which is her main advantage in combat. So for her abilities in campaign, she has the Enchanting Beauty, basically an Area X affecting enemies with reduced charge bonus and melee attack. She will also have regeneration, actually, with the Ember Amulet that you see here, and in addition she also gets the bound spell Wand of the Karadan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly. It's 2 usage of a bombardment spell, a massive major magical damage with a ton of armor piercing, so that is great, very strong against a single unit, as it says there. And in addition she also has the Heart Render and the Dark Sword. This causes a hex around her when she's in melee, affecting their enemies' melee defense and melee attack. Crone Hellebrand. She's a great melee lord, although very undefended with poor armor, no shield, and rather still compensating a little bit with the good melee defense. She has great melee attack and causes poison, so in addition she does armor piercing damage as well and has bonuses versus infantry. So she's really good at taking out every armored unit or any armored infantry, really good to put her into that circumstance. In campaign, she has the Gaze of Cain, basically affecting allies in range, a good range actually, 100 meters, 3 uses of giving them weapon damage, more melee attack, more leadership, but it may cause them to rampage. She also has Frenzy, as most Witch Elves have. Now, in addition, she will also get Witch Brew. This ability gives her, as you've seen before, more weapon damage, more melee attack, and also the possibility of rampaging. A good thing to counter all that rampage is that you can also get her with regeneration. Adding to that, she also has the Blood Frenzy. This is an augment for her when engaged in melee, giving her all sorts of more armor-piercing weapon damage, more vigor per second recovery, so that's really good. And in terms of quests, you can get the Amulet of Dark Fire, affecting allies with more spell resistance, and the Cursed Blade. This one is basically giving damage per second to nearby enemies while in melee, but only if she's losing melee combat. So if she's losing, they're gonna start taking damage, then she's not losing again until she is, and then they take damage, that sort of idea. Lokir Felhard, a good armored melee lord, although without a shield. He does have tons of armor, melee attack and melee defense, and also good weapon strength with bonuses versus infantry. So he's great, especially in the early game against any infantry unit, because he'll do a lot of damage to them, thus reinforcing your early game. So for his abilities, he has Dreaded Duelist, an augment ability to his melee defense and melee attack, great for him when he's fighting, of course, and he also has Merciless Slaver, a hex area ability, reducing enemy leadership by -6. In addition, via his quests, he'll get a passive ability, Helm of the Kraken, giving him, while he's in melee, regeneration, of course, and also melee defense buff. Malice Dark Blade. He's a great duelist style lord. He has good armor, good melee attack and great melee defense. The weapon strength is also mostly armor piercing, so he's great at taking out enemy characters as well. For his abilities, he has the Demon's Curse, a hex to all nearby enemies to lose leadership and melee defense. He also has the Blood Price, causing minor damage to himself and tons of damage, and a 20% ward save for him. He also can turn into Zarkan, which is a demon, basically. So he can use if the battle outcome is undecided, of course. As long as it is undecided, he can use it. And he becomes possessed, his health and fatigue are restored, which is great, and then he gets some different abilities. Such as, for instance, he gets the Blood Storm, which is an explosion that also gives Malice some ward save of 20%, and the Reaper of Souls. Now this is an ability that damages the enemy and heals himself, which is really cool. And finally, he does get the Warp Sword of Cain. Now this gives him regeneration and also a small amount of ward save, as long as, of course, leadership is higher than broken and as long as he is in melee. Rakarth, the last of your legendary lords. He is a great melee lord, has good armor but no shield, decent melee attack and melee defense, with the advantage of his weapon damage, because it is mostly armor piercing and also has a nice bonus versus large. So he's great at defeating any enemy lords on mounts, which is always excellent, especially the more the campaign goes on. So for his abilities, he has the Beast Lord's Gaze, augmenting a unit by their leadership, plus 16, more ward save, and it stops rampage. So if a unit has gone rampage, he can stop that. He also has the Whiplash, giving an ally unit some more weapon damage, more armor piercing damage, a charge speed, and charge bonus. In addition, he also has the Beast Armor of Current Car. Basically, this gives any large entities nearby more ward save and more defense. He also can get the Beast Slaver, definitely a nice ability, giving him more weapon damage, armor piercing weapon damage, and bonuses versus large. It's always active, so that's great. And finally, he can get the Whip of Agony. This is an interesting one. It reduces melee defense, and it also removes any terror or fear abilities from enemies. So if they would cause fear, if they would cause terror, they no longer cause it, and it makes them vulnerable to that, which is great. If you want a more hybrid choice, the Dreadlord of Sword and Crossbow is your take. Good hybrid melee range lord. He has good armor, decent melee attack, quite good melee attack, sorry, decent melee defense, that's what I wanted to say. His weapon strength is not mostly armor piercing, but he still has a good amount. But the biggest difference, of course, is that he has a ranged missile attack, which is also armor piercing. So this is how he's going to do most of the damage against any enemy lords or heroes. That should be his main target. He's quite accurate, so that's the main idea about this lord. So in campaign, your Dreadlord has the Volley of Dark Arrows, basically a magic missile attack with 3 charges with good armor piercing damage and quite effective at long range. And he also has the Darkened Skies here, which replaces the loose ability that you see on the other side, and it gives a reload skill improvement that affects allies in range. If you want a more traditional lord, basically the Dreadlord Sword and Shield, basically a good lord, a good melee lord with armor and a silver shield, so quite resistant to enemy missiles, a good melee attack and decent melee defense, not a lot of weapon strength. If you want a more focused anti-large lord, let's go for the High Beastmaster. Of course, he does have that anti-large bonus, which means that he'll be great at defeating enemy heroes or lords on mounts. So yep, that's the main usage of him. He doesn't have a lot of armor. He does have good melee attack and fairly decent melee defense, so he can survive a little bit on his own, and that's his main target. Enemy heroes, enemy lords, just make sure that he has some support. In terms of abilities for the High Beastmaster, he has Whiplash, which gives an allied unit that is not a lord or a hero more weapon damage, both normal and armor piercing, charge speed, and charge bonus. In addition, he also has Beast Slave, so basically, not Slayer, Slaver, basically giving him a bonus of weapon damage and bonuses versus large. And finally, your last lord, the Supreme Sorceress, a caster lord, either from the lore of death, dark, shadows, fire, or beasts, pretty much all of the really damage-dealing ones. She's very weak in combat, very low armor, very low hit points, low melee attack and low melee defense, very low weapon strength, so yeah, keep her away from combat at all costs. She's mainly used for, of course, her magic abilities. As for her abilities in campaign, she can get the Arnzippel's Black Horror, basically a wind spell with 1 usage, good with relatively good armor piercing, magical damage, so yeah, definitely a good addition to your lord there. And for your heroes, we have the Sorceress, which is basically your caster. You can have the Lord of Beasts, Dark, Death, Shadows, and Fire. She's nearly useless in combat, even with the mount. Protect her at all costs and avoid combat if possible. She has low stats across the board, low melee attack, low melee defense, low weapon strength, low armor. She's barely naked there. So basically, always keep her away from any combat and make use, of course, mostly of her spells. The Assassin is a good melee ranged hero with low armor, great melee attack with poison attacks as well. He has reduced melee defense and kind of decent weapon strength. Now his advantage is that he has actually a short range powerful missile attack, which also causes poison, does a lot of damage with reduced reload time. For the assassin's abilities, note something: he has Vanguard, he has Strider, he has Fire whilst moving, and Stalk. All of this making him a good ambusher, ensuring that he doesn't get hindered by terrain, that he can hide anywhere to do his damage. Then he can obtain the ability Dark Venom, which is a base weapon damage plus 90% usage once, a very good ability to use. Or you can choose also the Black Lotus. These are mutually exclusive, by the way. You can have it imbued with Discourage, which is a minor debuff of not minor, actually major debuff of minus 16 leadership to enemies. And finally, he also has the Assassin's Trophy, basically a hex that is you can use on a lord or hero, diminishing their melee defense and melee attack greatly, minus 24. So basically really good for him to try and snipe an enemy lord or hero. We have also the Death Hag, melee specialist, anti-infantry damage dealer, as you can see there. She doesn't have a lot of armor or hit points, so she's rather a glass cannon, because she does have a lot of melee attack and it is poison. Not a lot of melee defense, again on that glass cannon idea. Tons of weapon strength, actually not a lot of armor piercing, but bonuses versus infantry. So she's good against those light targets. Anyone that doesn't have too much armor, she can go there and do a lot of damage. That's her main purpose. She also has Frenzy, which is excellent with the same idea of that glass cannon hero. So for their abilities, she does have Frenzy, and do note that she has Murderous Mastery, so she'll cause fear later on when this procs. And also she has Witch Brew. The ability basically is the same as Hellebrand, so causing more weapon damage, more armor piercing weapon damage, more melee attack, as you can see there, and rampage possibilities, so be careful with that. The Master is a good melee hero with decent armor and a silver shield. He has average attack and good melee defense, so he's more of a defensive, more of a tank, basically. But he also has armor piercing weapon strength and the bonuses versus large. So you're going to use this guy against the enemy lords or heroes, for instance. That is his main utility, really. He also has the Guardian passive ability, which means that any allied lords or heroes in range will get a physical resistance buff. Starting off with the Bleak Swords. Basically your sword and shield infantry. They have a silver shield, decent melee attack and melee defense values, a decent amount as well of weapon strength. It's not common to have so much weapon strength on a tier 1 infantry, really. And in the later parts of the game, they do get a lot of good bonuses. They increase their armor, their leadership, the melee attack, melee defense, even the weapon strength. So they become more than like a tier 2 to tier 2.5 unit. So you can definitely use Bleak Swords throughout the campaign without an issue. And to complement the Bleak Swords, we have the Dread Spears. Basically, a shield and spear infantry. They have that silver shield, they have that bonus versus large. They have a little bit more melee defense than melee attack, so they're much better on the defensive side of things. In the late game, they do become much better, as in much more melee attack and melee defense values, better armor, so they will withstand even medium cavalry, and that's mainly their use. Just put them on the flanks to defend your missile units, and they'll secure them in place and survive for enough time for you to finish off the enemies with ease. And now to your first regiment of renown, the Hellebrand, the Dread Spears. They have a poison attacks, which is much better, of course. They'll diminish the strength of any enemies going against them. And of course, they do have better stats overall, better melee attack, better melee defense. They are really good in terms of being already a tier 2 sort of infantry for you to hold on to. They'll defeat most initial or early game monsters and cavalry units for sure, especially with some support, so definitely a great addition to your forces. Now to units that should be a frontline, but actually I do not consider too much. The Black Ark Corsairs, they're more of an anti-infantry damage dealer, so they'll have their bonuses versus infantry, but they have very poor melee defense, and although they have a lot of armor, not a lot of health, so perhaps these are better to stay behind the shielded units to ensure that they don't suffer any missile attacks to them, and then you send them in to finish off any enemies. So in the late game they kind of become better. Their melee attack and melee defense values improve a lot. Also their speed, so they can be quite fast, maybe even as a flanking unit. That's how I would use them properly, to ensure that you can get on the sides of the enemy infantry and deal out a lot of damage with them. Now for one of the most strategic units possibly in the roster, the Witch Elves. They are very anti-infantry unit. They have that bonus versus infantry, a good amount of weapon strength, but the best use is this. Their melee attack causes the Madness of Cain. This diminishes the enemy's speed and melee defense and also causes them to rampage, so the enemy won't be able to control them, and then you can make decisions much better in terms to eliminate that force. Say you can even send the Witch Elves with this ability against anyone that they shouldn't be fighting, because then you can compensate that and send someone in to finish off the job as soon as that unit is rampage. So they have physical resistance, which is good because they have almost nearly no armor, no shield, so they are very vulnerable against enemy missiles. They do have the frenzy as well to be immune to psychology, and they have murderous mastery. In the late game, as you can see there, they will get even more ward save, more physical resistance, and also better weapon strength and speed. Those are the ones that I will focus on. Of course, better stats overall, but the idea here is that you can use them very fast units to reach out to the enemy and make use of that Madness of Cain ability, so that you can surprise maybe units on flanks or maybe units even on the front line. It's up to your decision. They will do really well against enemy infantry. Just watch out for any missiles or enemy potentially enemy armored targets, of course, because they'll struggle against them. And now to a regiment of renown, the Sisters of the Singing Doom, Witch Elves. So basically these are a better version, of course, of the Witch Elves, and they have the distinct ability of causing terror, actually. So this is their main usage. You go in, you make sure that the enemy doesn't run away, they're rampaging, and then later on anyone that is nearby or that they can attack, they'll cause terror. They're very good at flanking the enemy and then getting rid of their flanks and suddenly going back into the front line on their backs, on their flanks, and causing them to rout. That's the main idea, a good addition to your forces. Now to one of the elite units that you may have, the Sisters of Slaughter. These are a defender unit, but you may see that they lack completely armor. You know, they're almost naked here. So the main idea of them is that they have quite a hefty hit point pool, and they also have some physical resistance, and in addition to that they also have the Trial of Blades, of passive ability that gives them more melee attack and more armor piercing weapon damage when they are losing melee combat. So if they are losing, they suddenly become much better at dealing damage, and in addition they also have poison, so they're very good at debuffing the enemy and ensuring that they don't suffer too much damage while they're maintaining the enemy there. Especially they can do that because of their high melee defense and physical resist, as we've seen. Now, in addition to the late game, they become really good at holding down the line. They have that shield, which is interesting because they'll survive some missiles, even though they don't have a lot of armor. And they're very fast. They'll get a lot of melee defense, physical resistance, ward save. So in essence, these girls can be in the front line. They'll survive the initial charge, and then you can send in any monsters, any cavalry, flank, whatever, to finish off. They're very good staying infantry, even though they are without any armor. It's just an awesome unit overall. the Harganeth Executioners, your high-tier anti-infantry unit. They are heavily armored, 100 armor, that's really good. Armor piercing and anti-infantry bonus as well. They have quite a significantly good melee attack, but lower melee defense. They do overcome that in the later stages of the game. More armor, more speed, more melee attack, more melee defense, even better weapon strength. So they'll become much better at dealing their damage against anyone, really. Any infantry, you can count on these guys to wipe them out. Especially if you charge them, always remember, and especially after they get that murderous mastery. Now to a regiment of renown, the Blades of the Blood Queen, the Executioners. These guys are basically Harganeth Executioners, but with better stats, and they also have Frenzy, so they do even more damage. They're immune to psychology. They also have the Guardian, so these are good ones to accompany your lord or hero into battle, and they'll cover him for him. They'll give him some physical resistance, which is always nice. So yeah, a decent addition to any army. Just make sure that you use them to their best ability, which is typically following the lord or hero to gain the maximum of that buff. If you want the top tier infantry units, and one of the best looking units in the game in my opinion, the Blackguard of Naggarond. Basically very heavily armored, armor piercing, anti-large unit, and that's a hefty bonus versus large. So they'll dish out, instead of the Harganeth Executioners, they'll dish out against the monsters, against the single entities, the lords on mounts, whatever you send them, they'll do their work. And particular in the late stages of the game, look at the melee defense up to 70, 51 melee attack, 115 armor, so they'll be really good against any large unit, and even non-large units, of course. There's certainly a good staple for any Dark Elf army. Just put these guys on the flanks, put these guys on the front line, they'll do their job. For your first missile infantry, the Dark Shards. They differ from other initial missile infantries from any armies because they do have armor-piercing missiles. This is great. This makes them a very good addition to any army whatsoever. You can use these guys even well into the late game. Probably you're going to use the shielded version, of course, but you can see from their stats they get increased everything, really, to the point that they can become, even in the late game, you can do just some armies around with Dark Shards just to sweep, you know, and defeat minor enemies for sure, because they do get, you know, good bonuses in armor, in leadership, speed, melee attack, melee defense, even their own weapon strength. They become a tier 1 infantry, let's say, a good one at that, with the ammunition. In addition, they do get more range and more missile strength, so that is always nice. And the next unit is the Dark Shards, but with shields, and quite a shield. It is actually a silver shield. So even though they have reduced range, of course the same as the other Dark Shards, these are such a good unit to have in any army. And especially because of that armor piercing and the silver shield, you can use these well into the late game, even if they wouldn't have enhanced combat capabilities, which they do. They get the bonuses for melee attack, for melee defense, so they become quite good at holding on their own, especially against, you know, lighter opponents. They'll be able to hold on their own, and they gain more range, more ammunition, more weapon, more missile damage. So certainly a wonderful addition to any Dark Elf army. Just ensure that they are not under attack by any strong opponents, such as an anti-infantry unit, or such as a big monster or something like that that would rip them. But otherwise, you can count on these guys to do a lot of damage quickly, especially if you focus fire with them. And now to a regiment of renown, the Bolt Fiends, Dark Shards with shields. The biggest difference is that these guys have the shield breakers, so they'll destroy the enemy shields. As if it wasn't enough, it wouldn't be enough that they already have armor piercing missile damage, but they also destroy the shields. So definitely the Dark Elves with these guys have a great notion of how to get rid of any armored opponent. Regardless, they'll always be vulnerable to their missiles. So a wonderful addition to any, especially early to mid-game army. You can use these guys to the late game, but they'll always be useful. Now to a very interesting unit, the Black Arc Corsairs with hand bows. So the idea from these guys is that they can actually fire while moving. They have reduced range, but their missile strength is quite nice. It's still not that much armor piercing, but it's still quite nice. And they have much better melee attack and melee defense stats. And also count on that armor, because they do have quite a lot of armor. So these guys can be more of a hybrid unit, really good. Just that reduced range, it's more like they are javeliners, really, you know, with that range. But in the late game they become much better, all on to the point that they become like a tier 2 infantry that has a range. So you can definitely feel these guys if you prefer, if that's your preferable style of play. So they'll always cause a lot of damage, especially because of their missile attack, and then when the enemy closes up, they still have a good amount of melee defense, melee attack to get rid of them, and even a hefty weapon strength. So yeah, definitely a good addition to any Dark Elf army. Now to one of the favorite units of many in the Dark Elf roster, the Shades. There's some variants with the dual weapons and great swords, but this is the basic one. Armor piercing missile damage and a good amount of damage at it. Also good range, not as much as typical archers, but they do have good range. Decent armor, decent melee attack and melee defense, so they can withstand their own against enemies during combat. Of course, just don't keep them in prolonged melee. It's more to ensure that they survive a little bit before you help them out. Now in the late game, these become a menace, really. Look at the stats. They become more of a tier 2 infantry unit altogether, with their armor, leadership, speed, melee attack and melee defense buffs. They also get more weapon strength, and if that wasn't enough, they also get more ammunition, more range, which is excellent. It's a lot of range, actually. They become much better at that, and also their missile strength also improves. So in essence, they'll just become much more of a hybrid unit, which is how you should use them. Maybe even position them on the flanks to get a nasty surprise, because they have stalk, they have vanguard deployment, so maybe you can use them in conjunction with cavalry, in conjunction with chariots, etc., or you use them just on the back of your front line. Whatever, they'll do a good job. But if you prefer someone that actually deals some more damage against infantry, Shades with dual weapons. Basically the same stats as the previous Shades, you use them the same way, but you can be more comfortable when they fight against infantry. So you can send them in to finish off the job against any enemy infantry, for instance. If they're about to rout, you just send them to charge in, and they'll do the damage necessary to put them out. Definitely in the late game they become much better at that, so more of a hybrid infantry unit. Against foes that don't have a lot of fast units, maybe you can even put these guys on the front line. So it's up to you. Just analyze the situation and ensure you get the best of it. They still get a good improvement in terms of range, in terms of ammunition and missile strength. That is their main idea, to use them as missile units, but by all means they can still hold on a little bit of the flank, a little bit of the front line. Just don't put them against Chosen, of course, but they can hold on really well. And the final variation is the Shades with the great swords. So in essence the same unit altogether, but the difference is that they now not only they have bonuses versus infantry, but their damage is also armor piercing. A much better choice to use in your front line even, or on the back of your front line. So in essence the idea behind these guys is that you'll use them to cause damage from afar, you know, pretty good range, pretty good missile strength, but if the enemy closes up, they'll still have a nasty surprise. Not that they're only 80 models, so that will be a big problem for them. Keep them out of harm's way against, they don't have a lot of armor or melee defense, but the fact that they can get much better in the late game is a good point, especially because they get more range, so they'll be able to fire more, you know, the same things as the other Shades, of course. But always remember that we are talking about a unit that is a missile infantry unit, but will get to the point of being a good hybrid unit, especially in the late game. Still, I typically just put them behind my Blackguards or Harganeth Executioners, and they just do really fine. This is just for you to theory craft, and that's the purpose precisely of getting you all these stats, so they can theory craft how you can use them in the late game. So for your first cavalry unit, the Dark Riders, a very fast and very light shock cavalry. Basically not a lot of in terms of stats, low armor, low leadership actually, low melee attack and melee defense, also not a lot of weapon strength. Most of the damage will come from the charge. So basically they're much better at flanking enemies or going on the rear. They have vanguard deployment, so you can go after those artillery units, for instance, or unaware missile units. They'll do their job, and that's the main purpose. Even in the late game they don't become anything more than just a better shock cavalry, better harassing cavalry, and that's how you should use it. Take advantage of that charge bonus, of that speed, of that mobility, but don't leave them in prolonged battle for too long. For a better light cavalry unit, the Dark Riders with shields, basically they do have that bronze shield, so they'll survive a little bit better against missile units. Not a lot in terms of stats, better melee defense of course. Still that vanguard deployment and that speed factor is the most important one. In the late game of course they'll get a little bit more armor, more leadership, but somewhat decent melee defense, but still the main use of this cavalry unit is to chase down any skirmishes, any artillery units, or run down any routing units. That's basically their main idea. And now for a much better cavalry, the Cold One Knights. These are anti-large armor piercing cavalry. They still have a lot of armor and a bronze shield, so they can avoid a little bit the missiles from the enemy. So the main idea from these guys is that they are much better at taking out those other cavalry units. They also have a passive ability with charge bonus, melee attack and physical resistance when they are under their half of their health. Now if you notice in the upgrades here, there's also a green value. This is if the this unit is led by a high beastmaster. You know, if your lord is a high beastmaster, he also has that chance of improving their melee attack there, their charge bonus, and they do become quite a good melee cavalry, something that you would send against enemy cavalries. These guys will go really well even up to the late game, especially with that armor piercing and anti-large. So that's their role, take out enemy cavalry so that others can do their job as well. Now to a very interesting cavalry, the Doomfire Warlocks. Now not a lot of armor, not a lot of melee attack or melee defense. They do have magical attacks and poison, so that alone would be a nice idea. You know, decent weapon strength overall, so that will be the idea. But adding to this, they do have a 40% physical resistance, so just ensure that they are not fighting anyone with magical attacks as well, and they can do quite a lot of damage. Now the main premise, they also vanguard deployed, and they have a couple of charges of 2 spells. Soul Blight, which is a nice debuff, one of the best debuffs there is. It's an area debuff for their weapon damage and armor of the enemy, and also they have the Lesser Doom Bolt, so it causes some damage as well. So that's the main use of these guys. They are already a good cavalry, but for the most part you're going to be using their abilities. Just ensure that you don't bring them on an army where you already have a lot of micro, because of course you'll need a lot of micro to get the best out of these guys. Now in the late game they also get some ward save and better stats overall, including more speed, more armor. So all in all they will be able to be a good melee cav while also having those spells. Just ensure that they are never under attack by anyone with magical attacks, otherwise they will crumble very easily. Now to a Regiment of Renown, the Slaanesh Harvesters, Doomfire Warlocks Regiment of Renown. Basically they still have that melee attack with magical attacks and poison damage, as you can see there. Still the same physical resistance, so what changes? The spells. They get Soul Stealer, which heals and damages the enemy, and also they get a different hex, this one with less accuracy and less melee attack. So do note that this one is not an area one. I do not know if I'd rather have actually the normal ones, but these ones of course with that healing should be a good idea. But still, just ensure that you get this on any artillery unit for instance, or any missile unit, so that they have reduced accuracy of course, and then you can run them down. Still the same uses of the other Doomfire Warlocks. Just ensure that you don't keep them too much in prolonged combat, and avoid like hell anything that has magical attacks. Now to your more elite cavalry, the Cold One Dread Knights. Very heavily armored and shielded, so they have that bronze shield, they have tons of armor, but they don't have a lot of speed. This is their main weakness. This is the biggest issue with these guys. They do have decent melee attack and melee defense, so they are melee cavalry, and they have good weapon strength, which is armor piercing. In addition, they also have the primal instinct, so more charge bonus, melee attack and physical resistance when they are with less than half health. Now also, they also cause fear, so this is much better than other ones, of course, so that they don't also suffer the penalties from fear, which is always great. Now, in the late game, these become such a menace, especially if you pair them with a high Beastmaster. As you can see there, they'll get up to 64 melee attack, even a better charge bonus, so they'll become a much better viable option, especially with all the melee attack, melee defense, weapon strength as well. They gain more speed, which is, it kind of implies that they lose their weaknesses really, which is why I always love to bring a couple of these, especially for the late game. And now to a Regiment of Renown, the Knights of the Ebon Claw, Dread Knights. Basically the same thing as the other ones, of course better stats because they do have 9 experience there, so much better melee attack, melee defense values, and the main difference is that they have the Murderous Mastery, so when that Murderous Prowess shows up, they'll gain the effects for much longer, with the 2 minutes of duration. So yeah, a nice addition for your heavy cavalry ones. Dark Riders with repeater crossbows. Basically the same thing as the Dark Riders, just slightly lesser melee attack and melee defense values, but still a fast unit, really. That's the sort of idea, skirmisher. But they do have armor piercing missiles, and the range is not that bad for, especially for a crossbow unit on a cavalry unit, and they still have that vanguard deployment, so that's their main use. They're going to be deployed earlier on. You can put these guys against anything that has armor, of course, and just skirmish them away in preparation for your main army to engage. Now in the later stages of the game, they get something really good, which is their range increases by a lot, actually 30%, which is excellent, and also their ammunition, so they'll be able to stand around just doing a lot of damage. Their speed has increased as well tremendously, so overall, even in the late game, you can find uses for these guys definitely, especially with such a high range. That's the biggest selling point that these guys get into the late game. Now to one of the most interesting Regiments of Renown, the Raven Heralds, repeater crossbow Regiments of Renown. Can you tell the difference? Well, they fly. They're much faster, they do have better melee attack and melee defense values, but nothing to, engage in melee with. Their missile strength is much better as well, because they do cause a lot of damage, and it's armor piercing as well. So the main idea of these guys is, of course, to harass the enemy. If they don't have anything to deal with flyers or fast flyers such as them, they're gonna have a bad time. So it's a wonderful unit to have in any army. Of course, the only downside is it's a Regiment of Renown. You can only have one. I wish we had more of these in this army, if we could have, but maybe that would be overpowered. But yeah, a wonderful addition to your armies. Next we have the Scourge Runner Chariots, a very versatile unit. They have bonuses versus infantry on their primary weapon, not a lot of melee attack or melee defense, but still decent speed and decent armor. But these are missile chariots, so they do have quite a lot of range, 150. It's really big. It's better than most of their other missile units. So far, it's the unit that has the biggest range. And they have an anti-large armor piercing missile. So they're very good against taking out enemy large targets from afar. And if you need them to attack infantry, by all means they can do that as well. Just be sure that you keep them out of combat for too long. Just charge and go back, and ensure that you cycle charge them, and that they are not in prolonged combat for too long, of course. Now the main difference for the late game is that they actually become much better in both roles, which is kind of surprising. Sometimes the chariots don't become better in this style. They only upgrade one or the other. But for the Scourge Runner, they actually have more armor, more speed, more melee attack and melee defense. There's still more charge bonus, so they can definitely do that role of a melee chariot really well. And you still get hefty ammunition, more range, more missile strength. So definitely they'll just become a really good jack of all trades for your armies. Always good to have a couple of these ones in your armies, and just ensure that, you know, don't keep them too much in prolonged combat, because of course they do lack the stats to be a melee unit, but they can do reasonably well against both large units and infantry. And now to a Regiment of Renown, and it's everything that I said about the Scourge Runner and Chariot, and better because they do have poison missile strength, which implies that good luck trying to catch them, you know, because the enemy is gonna have a really hard time trying to catch these guys, and all in the meantime they're gonna be shooting, they're gonna be causing damage. So a very good skirmishing chariot, really, just as long as they don't run out of space to run away or to skirmish the enemy away, they'll do a good job. And in addition, they do have a hex that affects all enemies if they are grounded. So you know, flying units would be the only unit that will go against these guys, but they will take away the speed and the missile resistance of anyone that is close by. So by all means, there's no more perfect unit for skirmishing duties than these guys. It's a shame that, you know, it's just one, the Ravagers of Rakarth, but that's what we get. Last but not least, the Cold One Chariot, still a missile chariot, but there's a slight difference that I'm going to showcase now. So they are predominantly armor piercing. They cause both weapon strength and missile strength armor piercing. They have a good bonuses versus infantry, so you can use these guys more against the infantry side of things instead of the Scourge Runner Chariots that you've seen before. There's still a lot of good missile strength, a lot of good range as well. They have lesser speed, which is their main weakness, really, but they gain a little bit more armor compared to the other chariots. So yeah, now the main difference is that in terms of stats, when they get upgraded, it's more on the melee side, so they become a much better much better chariot, and in essence you gain more speed, you gain more charge bonus, and especially if you use them under a high Beastmaster, they're gonna have more melee attack, more charge there. So definitely you can use these guys and just instead of focusing so much on cycle charging, you can avoid that a little bit. You don't have to micro too much, because they'll be able to withstand a little bit more punishment, cause a lot of damage, and you know, basically use these guys more as a cavalry unit instead of just a chariot. So I like this change of pace even in these missile chariots, that the Cold One Chariots are more designed to a melee role, really, compared to the Scourge Runners. Harpies are a very good, very fast, vanguard deployed flying unit. These are typically well used to harass the enemy lines, go after their artillery, go after their weaker units, and surprise them, because they actually have quite a nice weapon strength and melee defense. Not a lot of armor, not a lot of melee attack, so don't count on them doing a lot of damage. They're supposed to be there to harass. Now in the late game they become a little bit better. They'll become much more tanky, especially under high Beastmaster, as you can see there. That's the green value that you see there. So 56 melee defense possible, that's really good. And basically all the same role will apply. You'll use these guys against their skirmishers, their artillery. They'll just become much better at doing this. Now to a Regiment of Renown, a much better unit overall, the Crows of Cain. Still Harpies, ROR. Basically the same stats, more melee attack and more melee defense, of course, because they have, you know, they are tier 9, basically they're rank 9. But the advantage of these guys is that they actually have the Crow Feast, so they heal while in melee, implying that they are much better overall than the regular Harpies. So a good addition to any of your armies. It's a shame that you only get one, but that's always the case with RORs, right? Now to the Feral Manticore, basically a good single entity, mostly designed to harass enemy lords or heroes really, but they can do well against other targets. Decent weapon strength, some amount of armor piercing, which is always nice. Better melee attack than melee defense, not a lot of armor, no shield or anything like that, of course. Low leadership. The main issue with these guys is that they can rampage, so at one point you may lose control over them, which is a big problem. Still, they do cause terror, and sometimes they are very well used with just the terror ability. Of course, striking down on enemies from above and making sure that they rout, which is always a nice idea. Now, in the late game, they do get a lot of more weapon strength, speed, and charge bonus, making them a good cycle charge as well, but they also get a decent melee defense. I recommend running a couple of these with some high Beastmasters because they do get a little bit more melee defense and charge bonus, making them just a much better single entity overall. The War Hydra, a really nice beast in addition to the Dark Elves. Basically, just tons of melee attack and weapon strength, so they'll do a lot of damage. Not a lot of melee defense or armor, so more designed to do damage, but don't think they're not tanky, because they do have regeneration. Actually, they have 2 regenerations. The typical one, and then the another takes its place. It has 4 uses of this. Look at the amount of heal, plus 12%, so basically they're going to heal up really well. Only recharging if the hit points are less than 50% base, but in general you can ensure that these guys will stay in combat for long periods of time. It's really cool. And if it wasn't enough, they still have a fiery breath, so you can use this before engaging and they'll get rid of anyone. In the late game, they become a true monstrous unit. If you're running on a high Beastmaster, which you should, for if you want to plan out to use some more Hydras. They even get more melee attack and more melee defense, to the point that they get 77-54. Are you kidding me? It's more than anything. They'll be able to take down other single entities with that sort of power. And they also get some more physical resist. Did I mention that they also have 35% missile resist? Yeah, there's nothing these babies can't do. Now to a Regiment of Renown, the Chill of Sontar, War Hydra Regiment of Renown. Still the same stats, of course, improved because they do have unit rank 9. Still decent weapon strength and armor piercing, still the same. What is the difference here is, well, they do have the Frostbite, reducing enemy speed by 30%, so good luck trying to get rid of this guy. And the Fiery Breath turns into a Frost Breath, so the breath also causes Frostbite. Powerful explosion as well, still the same thing as any breath attack, of course. So yeah, that's the main selling point. These guys, if the other ones were for fire, these ones are for cold, and that's the main idea. Good luck trying to run away from one of these guys. Now to one of my favorites, the Charybdis. Definitely deserving that monster killer title. These are anti-large single entities with a really good amount of armor piercing as well, and they still have the poison, so it debuffs the enemy that they are fighting. And if it wasn't enough, they have an hex, an area ability that reduces enemy leadership. What else? They're perfect to take down any single entities, any lords on mounts. Send them towards them, they'll do the job, trust me. Now in the late game, even further, they'll do so much damage, especially with that high melee attack and melee defense. Just look at those values, even without putting them on a high Beastmaster. But if you can put them on a high Beastmaster, I mean, they'll do really well against anyone, any monsters. Perfect for me. That's what I use them for, against any single entities, but they'll take care of cavalry, they'll take care of anything that is large or even not large. It's just a great unit overall. If flying power is your thing, just get a few black dragons. Now they are just your typical dragon, of course, tons of weapon strength and armor piercing at that, a good amount of armor, good speed, decent melee attack and melee defense values, so you can cycle charge with them, or you can just leave them there in combat for a a small period of time, they'll do a lot of damage there for sure. In addition, he does have the Noxious Breath. This breath attack is strong against a single unit, and it does have some significant, like a third of armor piercing, so you can use these against any units really, and they'll do a lot of good damage. So overall, in the late game, of course, Black Dragons will become much better, but how much better? They'll become a melee powerhouse. I mean, look at that weapon strength, the melee attack, the melee defense, even the speed and charge bonus. So whenever you charge with them, they'll do a lot of damage, and as if it wasn't enough, even them staying there, they'll do a lot of damage. So basically you can just fire and forget about these guys, and they'll do damage to whatever they find there. The Bloodwreck Medusa, a nice hybrid unit missile monster really. They do have armor piercing missiles and weapon strength. Their ammunition is magical damage, so they are very good against those with physical resistances as well. They have a decent amount of missile strength, also with bonuses versus infantry, so perhaps better designed to deal out damage against those units with physical resistances, or infantry units of course, but it's not like they cannot go in melee as well, so definitely a really nice addition if you want a monster that can go on the flanks, on the front line, wherever you put them, they'll do their damage. Now, in particular, in the late game, they can become quite a nice hybrid unit, really for sure, because they do get bonuses in everything. They get more ward save, more physical resistance, they get more weapon strength, more charge bonus. So by all means, the enemy is going to try to charge these guys, you're going to charge them back, and you're going to do a lot of damage. Just ensure that you keep an eye out for enemy missiles, because they don't have a lot of armor, they don't have any shield, they still have low hit points, but yeah, certainly a nice addition to your armies, just even if it is just for some versatility. And now time for the last regiment of renown, the Siren of Red Ruin. Siren? Bloodwreck Medusa ROR. So she's still the hybrid unit, still anti-infantry with armor-piercing missile damages, with magical attacks there in the missile attacks, but she differs in having this ability, the Whale of Malice, a direct damage area. It's really cool to affect all enemies in the area basically. So alongside having all that hybrid idea, she still can cast some spells, so definitely a nice addition for your armies. The Bloodwreck Shrine, it's quite a nice magic chariot here, so it does have quite a nice weapon strength with bonus versus infantry. The main idea is that it still has a ranged attack, not a lot of range, but still magical attacks with missile strength, with armor piercing, with bonus versus infantry. The biggest selling point is actually two auras that it has. The first one affects allies in range if they are in melee, so if you're in melee with this chariot, then it will give nearby allies melee attack and leadership, and if to the enemies it will give them less leadership and less melee defense. So definitely a good addition to your front line. Sometimes you may be thinking if your front line is not good enough, you can just pop one of these there and they'll do the damage that you need. Now they still have 25% missile resistance and 25% spell resistance. In the late game they get quite some nice buffs, especially weapon strength and still charge bonus, so they'll become a better chariot overall, and definitely you want to use them near your frontline units, so it's always a good idea. Just ensure that you keep them away of harm's way, because not a lot of armor, actually they do have quite significantly better armor really, but the melee defense is a big problem. It's one of the things that if you get these with a high Beastmaster, it's much better because they do get that melee defense increase. So yeah, definitely a nice unit to be versatile on the battlefield. And for your artillery unit, the Reaper Bolt Throwers. Now, they do have armor piercing missiles and with the bonuses versus large, or with the bonuses versus infantry. You can choose to shoot just one or many shots, which of course has the difference on how effective they are against different targets. I mainly use them with the single shot round against any single entities, such as Lords and Heroes on mounts, or of course other single entities, cavalry for instance, or other monsters monsters are also good targets for them. Now in the late game they get even better missile strength, more ammunition, so of course you'll have ammunition for days, definitely. Better reload time, so they'll shoot much faster, typically better against those single entities, those lords, of course, to diminish their health up until they come forward to your front line, of course. Hilariously, they also get weapon strength and armor, so at least they'll be able to do some damage if anyone comes to them. But yeah, the main deal here is to a decent artillery unit that can fire either on large entities or on infantry units, and always a good addition to your forces. And there you go. All the units from the Dark Elf roster before and after all the upgrades. I hope this helps you guys to get a better grasp of what units and army compositions you can get with the Dark Elves. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time.